Hi, everyone, and welcome to Class 8 Personal Finance. I'm Garrett O'Hara, and what is this weird mixture of colors? When we talk about stock funds, a lot of folks will talk about large cap funds or small cap funds or total market funds. What are all these types of funds and how do they all fit together? How do they fit into a portfolio situation, especially when you have multiple accounts? Every so often, you see someone on YouTube own both a total stock market index fund as well as an S&P 500 index fund, and you just if you know what you're talking about and you're looking at these two different types of funds, you're like, why? Why would you own both? Why would you not just stick with one? Let's talk about how these things kind of fit together. We'll start simple and then we'll get more complex as we go on. There's a few ways to think about this. I have three graphical aids to help us out today. One is the Vanguard one. The Vanguard Basic Fund. It's not the first one. It's actually a relatively new fund. A few years. How many years old is it? I don't know, but it's not an original one. This is VT on the left here, which is Vanguard's Total World Stock Index Fund. It has an expense ratio of 0.08, which is reasonably cheap, and they basically just try to purchase every single stock in the entire world in order of market capitalization. That's basically how big the company is. Apple happens to be the biggest company in the world on the public stock exchanges, and so Apple is the biggest stock within VT. You go down there from there, and you could perhaps split this into two. I have VTI here, and VTI is Vanguard's total US stock market index fund. And if you were to hold 60% VTI and 40% VXUS, you would have basically VT. That's how it is right now. Now, VT could switch around. Perhaps the US experiences a stock market crash and VXUS doesn't. VT would be affected. It might become more like a 50-50 if the US went down by 1/6, for example, and VXUS just didn't care and the international stock markets, well, the markets outside the US, weren't affected. So suppose you have a 60-40 in VTI and VXUS, that roughly equals VT. So the question then would be, okay, could someone own VT and VTI? Well, you could, but why wouldn't you just put VTI and VXUS in the proportions that you prefer? Now you go on from there and you could split the US into two as well. You have the S&P 500 index fund. That's pretty much Vanguard's original one, although they didn't have an ETF at that point. Vanguard is weird. They have ETFs that are also mutual funds. They're basically share classes of the same fund. So if you have VOO, you basically have the original Vanguard fund, which is pretty cool for historical purposes. VOO has an expense ratio also of 0.03%. And if you wanted to own the rest of the stock market included in VTI, you could buy VXF. That's the extended market fund. That has an expense ratio of 0.06, so it's a little more expensive, nothing much to worry about. Why would you want to own both? Well, one, you could try to tilt. You could say, I want less S&P 500 and I want more of the smaller stocks. You could own both VOO and VXF and go outside of this 80-20 ratio. You could say a 70-30 ratio. Say, I'm going to tilt a little more towards these smaller stocks. And there are good reasons to do that. I do that. Not this in particular, but I tilt towards small cap stocks quite heavily. But the point is that you should know what you're doing. You should know that you are tilting, and you should know why you are, rather than just being completely ignorant of what's going on. Now, you can do something similar with the international funds. Now, the international funds aren't split out with large cap and small cap here like they are with the US. Let me pull up, and I had this up earlier, and I had it up in the first video. This is the second video that I'm trying to upload onto the channel, and so far my microphone hasn't died. In fact, I have the microphone level very much in front of me and very visible. And so far, it hasn't died, which is great. So I'm going to pull up FTSE country classification. You can Google this if you like. FTSE is the index provider that Vanguard is using for these funds. And you can go to this. Wow, I went too far. You're going to go to this chart here, and you can see the different categories of international markets. You can split them into basically three. You have developed markets on the left, and these are largely free developed democracies, except Hong Kong. That's pretty recent. You have the emerging markets countries, which are some are free countries, but just not as developed, and some are outright dictatorships like China. I like splitting out my emerging markets to have only the free countries, but that's another video. And then you have the frontier markets. The frontier markets are much more expensive to access. For that reason, Vanguard does not have a frontier markets fund, I do not believe. So that's when you're looking at, going back here, you can see VEA is the FTSE Developed Markets Index Fund. So the countries that VEA invests in are, that's the wrong one, are these right here, Australia through the UK, not the USA, because it's not, it's, I'm back. Woo! All right. I'll take a look at the recording and see if I can save that or whatnot. We shall see. I'm going to keep going. You have Developed Markets Index Fund right here, and that covers these countries except the USA. Then you have the FTSE Emerging Markets Index Fund. It has an expense ratio of 0.10, still pretty cheap. And you can see, I listed it out here, China, Taiwan, India, Brazil, Greece, Mexico, etc. Your emerging markets countries. One thing I want to say about emerging markets is that it is a bit of a politically correct term. The term apparently back in the early 90s was undeveloped markets. And the reason I know that is because I was watching a speech given by Peter Lynch. It's up on YouTube somewhere, and he was criticizing the fact that they started calling these things emerging markets countries. Why? Well, because the term emerging in the English language implies some sort of upward movement. They're emerging, and they have all eventually become developed markets. And that's not necessarily true. The countries could very well degrade or fall into political chaos and economic chaos and turn into frontier markets. So emerging is just a term for the countries in the middle. Don't think that just because they're called emerging, well, they're emerging, that means they're going up. We better invest in them now. No, don't do it based on that. Unfortunately, we're just kind of stuck with the term. You ought to come up with a better term that separates them from frontier markets. You can't just say undeveloped markets now, because there are frontier markets, and you've got to be able to separate the two, the emerging markets and the frontier markets. So I don't know. Maybe there's another word that someone could come up with, but I don't think anyone's going to fix that at this point. So that's how you have these four right here. Now, why would you want to split these out? Personally, if I'm developing some sort of four-fund portfolio, I did a video on this. It doesn't look very good, so I might redo it. But here's what I constructed. I had VTI for the US and VEA in a 60-40 ratio. So just like the ratio in the world, that works for us in the US. It might not work if you're outside the US because you might want some home country bias. Here in the US, we think that the world revolves around us, and we have the US dollar as our currency. I plan to retire in the US and spend US dollars while retired. So that all works. For us, if you're Canadian, for example, your stock market is only 3% of the world, but you probably want more than 3% in Canadian stocks. There's some tax benefits to that, as I understand. And, well, you're going to be spending Canadian dollars when you retire. So, you know, you're probably going to want some home country bias and have more Canadian dollars involved in your portfolio. That's what I'm saying. Let's go back to the Vanguard one for a moment. Why does this matter? If you have multiple accounts, let's say you have an account with, you have a 401k account and they have an S&P 500 index fund, and you're trying to look at your portfolio as a whole, you might want to construct a spreadsheet and have both an S&P 500 side, and then you go to another account and you have VXF and you try to complete that into the total US stock market, that kind of thing. So you're going to have to think about this in a spreadsheet rather than just try to approximate it with each account. You can have a spreadsheet where you look at things as a whole and you know what's going on, you know what you're. I'm back. So, what was I talking about? I was talking about why you want to do a layout like this. And what I basically said was you have if you have different accounts, you want to be able to look at things as a whole and have a holistic look at your portfolio and know how everything fits together. I have a separate one like this for iShares. Now, iShares has a world index fund as well, but the expense ratio is pretty high. It's 0.24%. If you're going to go with something like that, I'm almost always going to tell you just go with VT, just because it's that much cheaper. But iShares has its own total U.S. stock market index fund. It's based on a different index, but it'll work. They have a total international stock market index fund, and I think it's a little more expensive. Let's see, the Vanguard's is 0.08, iShares 0.09, not a huge difference. And then iShares has, they don't have a completion index ETF, but they do have S&P 400 and 600. So yes, there are other S&P funds other than the 500. There's even a 1500 index, and I think that may be the one that ITOT is based on. I would have to double check that. They also have a developed markets index fund and an emerging markets index fund. Now, the thing to note about this one is it's based on a different index provider, MSCI rather than FTSE, and they have different opinions about which countries belong in which categories. And the big one there is South Korea. MSCI believes South Korea to be an emerging markets country, whereas FTSE, or FTSE as it's spelled, believes South Korea to be a developed markets country. So if you look closely here, I have South Korea listed here next to VEA, but with iShares, South Korea is with the emerging markets one, IEMG. Why does this matter? Well, if you kind of go, hey, I like Vanguard's developed markets index fund because it has South Korea in it, and then you prefer IEMG, which has South Korea in it. Okay, now you're doubled up on South Korea, which could be a very rational thing to do, but you want to know that's what you're actually doing. A lot of 401k plans have what's called the MSCI EAFE index. That's EAFE, and that stands for Europe, Australasia, Far East. And because it's MSCI, MSCI says South Korea is an emerging markets country. Then you don't have South Korea in your developed markets fund within your 401k. Then you go to your Roth IRA and you're like, hey, I need some emerging markets because I don't have it within my 401k. I'm going to go with the Vanguard one because the Vanguard one is cheaper and I like Vanguard. Okay, so you just go with VWO, but you still don't have South Korea in there. Okay, now you have no South Korea. Again, if you don't like South Korea, well, okay, I like South Korea. I want some South Korea in there. So if you have an Is it back? Hey, it's back. I'm going to have to see why it's doing this. It's really annoying. So if you have South Korea, rather, if you have an MSCI fund in your 401k and you need emerging markets and you don't have emerging markets in your 401k, you definitely don't have it in thrift savings plan if you're military. I'll tell you that. Then you might want to go with an emerging markets fund that includes South Korea. Think about that. Finally, there is this little graph right here. And I can leave a link to this in the description. And this is something that Vanguard has put out. I don't know if it's still on Vanguard's website, but I still think it's still pretty handy because you can see Vanguard's VTI, Total Stock Market Index. So it's about 99% of the entire U.S. This is only the U.S., by the way. This isn't international. You can see the Standard & Poor's S&P funds here. So you have the S&P 500. Now, here's the thing. This is going by the number of stocks for the height rather than the market capitalization. I did this one here in Google Sheets by market capitalization. So how tall these blocks are is based upon the sizes of the companies that are in there. That's why you have 500 companies right here in this whole block, but you have 1,000 companies in a smaller block. It's because these 500 companies are larger by proportion. You look at a graph like this, and my one pet peeve is that it's the number of companies. And so the S&P 500 looks really tiny. But in fact, there's a lot more money going on in here. And you can see that by the percentages. This little tiny thing right here is 82%, whereas you have 7% here and then 3% in this even bigger block, 19% within the S&P completion index. And then finally, my particular 401k at my employer is weird because they decided for whatever reason to switch up index providers among the 3 U.S. funds that it has. My 401k has the S&P 500 index, the S&P 400 index, the mid cap, and the Russell 2000. And so here, what you could probably do is if you're trying to replicate a total stock market approach, you want to try to get, if you're trying to get as close to this as you can, what you can do is add up 82 plus 7, which is 89. 89 plus 8 is, 95? Did I get that right? 89 plus 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14, 16, 97. I should be better at this. So 97%. So you could say 8 divided by 97, if you want to be really, really, really picky about this. 8 divided by 97 is still 8. So 8 divided, let me drag this over. So 8 divided by 97 is 0.08. So you still want 8% in the Russell 2000. And then 7 divided by 97 is still 7. So you could say in a 401k situation, if you're trying to replicate the total stock market, you could say 8% in the Russell 2000, 7% in the S&P 400 mid cap, and then 8 plus 7 is 15. Did I get that right? 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Yeah, so 15. And then you put 85% rather than 82% here in the S&P 500, and you would basically be replicating the total U.S. stock market. And if you want any greater percentage than those, then that's where you would want to at least have some intentionality there. Okay, why are you tilting to the mid caps and the small caps? And if you don't know what you're doing in terms of tilting mid cap or small cap, you probably just want to stay away from that and just go with the percentages prescribed. With that in mind, like, share, and subscribe if you're enjoying the channel. And I will see you in the next video if I even keep on doing this. I'm going to try to figure out why the mic keeps dying.